Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Treblle. It's a live hackathon. So today's going to be 4 live streams. I started it off and had to introduce myself, but luckily I can introduce my good friend Jim, that side of me, who is a senior developer advocate at Vonage. He's got an amazing talk called From Toolkit to Coolkit. So I'm going to leave it to Jim. Thank you again, Jim. Awesome having you on here. I'm going to let you do your thing. I'm going to go make a coffee. Go be awesome.
And off he goes. Thanks for the intro, Steve. Thanks for inviting me. Hello, everybody. I am Jim Seconde. And this is going to be tuning SDKs from Toolkit to Coolkit, which is, thanks, ChatGPT. I mean, you know, I've got to make it a little bit snazzy. I am a senior developer advocate at Vonage. Here's my stuff if you want to contact me. I'm on X and I'm on the PHP instance of Mastodon, and there's LinkedIn and there's GitHub. And Vonage, for anyone who doesn't know, is a cloud communications platform. So you can integrate by sending SMSs and WhatsApp. You can have 2-factor authentication. There's a video API, that sort of thing. This is a hackathon. So if you want to, in the next week coming up, want to do anything involving communications, I can hit you up about, or hit me up about it rather. We have SDKs in PHP, which is my one, but we also have a Node.js one in TypeScript. We have Ruby, we have Python, we have .NET, we have Java, etc., etc. So I'm just going to do a bit of an outline. Some of you might have come from Steve's talk, and it was sort of started building out. There were quite a lot of questions being asked around it that are really the kind of theme of this talk. So hopefully I should be able to answer them. So there are 4 questions for this, which are: what actually is an SDK? We really are going to have to start from the beginning. Some of you may know, but you've got to have some sort of starting point. Why build one? As Steve has shown you sort of starting to build out methods and methodologies and thinking of how to actually build an SDK. And if you have built one, more importantly, how to maintain it. And at the end of this talk, I kind of want a conclusion that you want to have fallen into 2 camps. The camps that we want to be in is Yoda, but as this is Friday the 13th, we don't want to be Jason, do we really? So you'll see more from Yoda and Jason as we go on. This talk also has a couple of assumptions, and it does answer a question from the earlier session about the difference between an API and an SDK, and we will get onto that. But there are a couple of assumptions that when I am talking about an SDK, it will be an SDK that is overlapping a REST or a GraphQL or an RPC, i.e. HTTP, TCP API. It's not anything that is embedded, so it's not Android, or it's not Linux, or it's not Windows, .NET, or C#. That's interacting within the operating system itself. This one is about an SDK that uses an underlying API. So let's get started. Why? Why should I build an SDK? Well, first part is, I don't know, it's quite simple. That comes from sort of the open source world, really, is that building an SDK is effectively you as a developer thinking, I can do better than this, or this doesn't exist, so I'm going to make it. So I'm going to make other developers' lives easier. Because effectively, with a lot of open source like frameworks, that's what we do. And you'll face challenges when doing this, because not every API is the same. A lot of standards and coding, we'll get onto that, is the way that APIs behave is not standardized, and you will encounter things that shouldn't behave the way that they do, but they will, which means you're going to be presented with challenges, which means if you learn how to tackle them and talk to other people about them, you get skills out of it, which is good. And the next one is, I can't promise anything, but if you're trying to get hired or you're looking for your first role, if someone sees that you maintain an SDK, you might get a job offer about it. And, making this up, I am not. I'm not making it up because the person who just presented the last session was Steve, and his first job, I think, as a full stack developer basically got bagged because he wrote an SDK. I'm not making it up. So, what is it? I said we've got to start from somewhere. You can't just sort of go into it. You know, we have to have some assumed knowledge that with this. So, it's tools and libraries as a collection that make things easier. It's not one thing. So, a good example is the Android kit. You've got an SDK, and you have in the SDK you have the IDE, and you have language and CLI tooling, and you've got the IDE being Android Studio, but then you've got package management from Jetpack and Compose, etc. You've got emulators. This all comprises the software development kit. So that is essentially that's essentially what they are. And what they do is, by necessity, they abstract out parts of building software that are cumbersome, that you don't want to deal with. If something is repetitive or annoying or boring or requires an implementation to be done over and over again, you're trying to take the headache away from them. An example, for instance, is you need to obfuscate things that developers don't want to do. So your API, that's a REST API, might have, depending on what part of the product it is you're doing, might have one base API path, and then might also have another one, and you have to choose between the two of them. And that means that the developer's got to consider both of these scenarios and routing. The SDK will take that out and say, I will deal with this because I'm going to be clever about it, making things easier. Also, in some cases, like things that you do on something like AWS or Google Cloud Platform, API calls and product are part of products, and they cost money. So why not, in your SDK, have validation of how something is going to be transmitted over HTTP? Why not have the SDK validate it first before hitting it? That is a classic kind of example of use cases of what an SDK does for you. So let's start building it. How to build? The first question that a lot of people ask of, like, right, where do I start? And a lot of sort of boot campers say to me, like, they worry, and one of the questions is, but has it been done before? Because if it has been done before, or it exists, then I shouldn't do it. But why? But why shouldn't you do it? Because here's a great example, right? In 2009, this company created online service where you logged in and you ordered a DVD and it would send it in the post. And a competitor came out and said, I think we can do better. And it was that. And then they quickly decided that they were going to move into streaming rather than posting things. Sometimes it doesn't matter if it's been done or not. It's either a good exercise for you to learn how to build an SDK anyway, or you might be able to do better. So it shouldn't be a blocker. This one that's coming up next is really, really important because there is a way to differentiate an SDK from what some people think it is. You might be tempted when building to use a framework, such as, I've just picked some of the biggest ones like Laravel or Symfony or Django or FastAPI, Gatsby, Next.js, etc. First piece of advice, no. Nope. Do not use a framework. A framework is not for building SDKs. A framework is for assisting application development. You are building an SDK that the framework itself is going to use in some capacity. Now, you may say, but you can build plugins or you can build modules. That's what those are. If you build a Laravel plugin that then has a service provider that you publish, that's not an SDK. That's a plugin, and it will use the SDK underneath the hood. If you're going to code an SDK, you need it to be raw because it will be reused by multiple frameworks. Take, for instance, TypeScript in the JavaScript world, which means that you're going to be coding in a raw language of PHP, say Python or TypeScript. When you set out to do it, please don't just throw code out. There's an XKCD for everything, and I have one. Use the standards in your language and world that are the most industry standard ways of doing things. I work in PHP, therefore I work to PSR standards, or the new thing, which I can't remember what it's called, PSO. if you code in TypeScript, look towards ECMAScript types, ECMAScript standards, etc. Right, and there are style guides for Python and Ruby, because if you're going to open source this SDK, which is the most likely thing that you'll be doing, then other people are going to view your code, and also you want other people to commit and modify and improve your code. If you do not, if it's the Wild West and there are no standards and people don't know what they're looking at, they won't be interested. This came up in the last talk. An SDK is not a wrapper for an API. If it's just a wrapper, that means that you're putting some methods in the language that you're working in and then doing curl or wget calls. But why can't the developer just do that anyway? They could, if they wanted to, they could just do it. It needs to be more than a wrapper. So for instance, an API that I worked with at Vonage recently had a system where you had to upload a logo with a transparent background, and you had to do it 3 times. So it was 3 different endpoints that actually had S3, Amazon AWS S3 buckets underneath. The SDK took care of that for you. So, oh good, my cat is here as per usual. It really wouldn't be a talk of me doing it at home without my cat interrupting. So it's not just a wrapper. It needs to be, in the case of what I said there, you did a function with this logo, and it would take care of all 3 requests for you, because you don't want to have to deal with that. So you're adding your domain logic to make developers' lives easier. Testing is for the living. Test-driven development in an SDK is very important. It's very important because you, in your tests, if you do test-driven, I would recommend, if you don't do it, then you just learn how to do it and watch tutorials how to do it. It will encapsulate and show developers what your code in your SDK is supposed to do. The tests are almost a key chunk of the documentation. So in the way that we approach it for something like APIs that are over the wire over HTTP, here are 3 examples for 3 different worlds. One is from the PHP world, one is from Python, and one is from Ruby. In PHP, there is a library called Prophecy, and there is a link to it. In Python, in PyTest, there is one called PyTest Mock. And in Ruby for RSpec, there is RSpec Expectations. And what these do is allow you to look at the future of what a method will do. And this is really important, because in an SDK, the important thing to test is you can make a mock response that comes back, but it's what's going out, what is in the request. So Prophecy, for instance, will say, when you call this method on the SDK, it will call it and it will fire off a request. You're not going to actually fire off the request. I don't care about that. I care about what I am sending to the underlying third-party API. The test will then document what is supposed to happen. That's an example of why it's important to do it. Coding it, we have seen a bit of code earlier. Please do this. Code with value objects. It's so... I've seen things coded not within value objects, and I'll show you concrete examples of what I mean, but the things you need to do in SDK to make it solid, you need to type hint your arguments, your function arguments. You need to type hint your return types. If something is arbitrary, like it's just something, and there's nothing that describes what it is or what its domain logic is, it's confusing, and I'll show you an example of that. But value objects are concrete objects that evidently, when you type hint and then when you encapsulate behavior, they become self-documenting. So how not to do it, for instance, when I talk about if something is arbitrary, here is a TypeScript example. It's called function handle request. It takes an action. What's that? Well, I suppose you could work out by the fact that it's got get and post there. And then you've got options. What's that? Okay, the action, well, if action is get, then you get. Okay, fine. Else if, okay, if the action is post, then API service post sausages.snake options 2. If also that doesn't happen, then options 1 equals mushrooms, then mushroom service badger options. And then finally, if nothing else happens, I'm just going to send action and options. Look, the thing is that. What's that? That's okay. We know it's an array because there are array calls on it, but what's in it? I have no idea. I mean, it might as well go, I am Groot. It could be absolutely anything. This is where we need value objects. Here's an example of value objects. So This is in my SDK. It's a request that gets sent when you want to do a verification in two-factor authentication. First of all, using open object-oriented programming, I've extended off a base verify request. I won't show you what that is, but here are some properties that are on here, and then I have an SMS that extends off it. Underneath, the constructor says the to, for instance, has to be a string, and it will be protected. We will get onto access modifiers later. Importantly, here is our first value object. You could have a string called locale that says en_US, which means it is English US. But that's not what I've done. Instead, I have a verification locale object. It automatically sets itself to null and then does a check. If it is null, I'm going to create it. And the reason why we do that is because the verification locale has defaults when you create one. So you can either pass one in that you have made yourself, or I will do the rest of it for you. So what does the verification locale look like? Here's an example of it. It's got a constructor, and the important bit here is a protected string with code English US. That tells you exactly, if you do not specify it, what I will do. And then I have encapsulated the fact that if you give me a load of locales that are not in the ISO standard, I will throw an error. You can't see the list, but there is a property on there which is an array of permitted codes. And then you have a string which comes back, which is from get code. And importantly, when you set a code, it has to be a string, and it's a fluent setter, so it returns itself. So what we could have done is we could have said, just put in English US, but we're not doing that at all. We're putting an encapsulated object within there, and that is self-documenting your code. It's really, really super important. Otherwise, arbitrary arrays are thrown everywhere, and you don't want that. Once you've started, maintaining is hard. I'm not going to lie. It takes a bit of practice, and it takes a bit of cognitive effort, and you will run into the same kind of things that we all run into as maintainers. The first thing is noise. People are on the internet, and your code is on the internet. Unfortunately, the internet is a very stupid place filled with a lot of horrible people. And if you're unlucky, I'm not saying it's going to happen, you might just bump into someone that wants to have an argument. There are preventative measures on how to deal with this, and therefore I will show you them. But be prepared that you're going to get noise. That's a real world example of, it's actually an automated one, but someone just going, no, nope. So how to regulate it? Code of conduct. Lots of people, when they start projects, they think of code of conducts and licenses, and we'll get onto that in a minute, as some sort of annoyance that you sort of should put in, but it doesn't really mean anything. If you want to own your SDK and make a go of it and actually get adoption of it where people are using it, your code of conduct really needs to protect you. Here are two examples below where you can find them. You can either go to opensource.guide, or you can go to the Django project in Python, which has a really, really super good code of conduct. If someone is putting an argument in GitHub issues or GitLab issues and not making any sense, or they tell you you're stupid, or they don't like your approach, you don't have the brain life cycles to deal with that, then don't deal with it. Say code of conduct, bang, hammer comes down. That's it, done. Similarly, like I said with codes of conduct, license choices, you may think just pick the first thing that comes up when it comes to licenses, but licenses are important. And the Open Source Foundation have a site called choosealicense.com, which is on there, which breaks it down far more simply of which you should pick. But why should you pick it? And the answer is you don't want to be giving this guy lots of money. If you don't properly license your thing, it is quite possible that some major company will spot it and go, that's a good use case, and they will take your stuff and they will make themselves richer off it. If you properly license it, they can't do that. So a good example of this, for instance, is how Android approached working with Java. And they didn't actually pay the licensing for it and thought they could get away with it. They didn't, which is why Kotlin appeared in the first place and had to be separated and forked. Make sure that you have control over your assets. Talking of the noise, issue templates, which will be available in any source code provider, such as GitLab or GitHub or Bitbucket, issue templates are really important. The example I've given there is the issue template that Chris Tankersley wrote for the PHP library that I maintain, but Issue templates stop this from happening, and this will happen if you don't do it. Freddie appears and goes, "Hi, SDK is bust. Can you fix, please?" Thank you. That's really super helpful. Could you tell me maybe a little bit more? Because really, if you say, "Hi, SDK is bust. Can you fix?" it's really the same thing as saying, "Hello, Jim. Sausages o'clock." It tells me nothing. Absolutely nothing. The issue template, which you'll see, you can get default ones out of GitHub, and it breaks down. I want screenshots. I want what programming language version, what framework you might be using on top of that. I need more info in order to help you. If you have more info, you can answer your developers who are trying to use your SDK in a more timely fashion that is useful to everybody. And we'll get on to, well, not get on to, that leads me on to the next slide. Empathy. It's very easy when coding this thing to forget that when you create an SDK, this is very different from creating a product. And the reason it's very, very different is because you are now writing code for other developers to consume. And you have to have, in order to be successful with this, that empathy. If you don't have that empathy, what you get is flame wars within an open source project, and it doesn't help anybody. Empathy is thinking back to that time that we all started out somewhere. In a real life use case, for instance, I was given the keys to AWS Amazon in one of my previous jobs about 4 or 5 jobs ago. And within 2 days, with no security, I'd accidentally deleted the EC2 box that the entire website ran on. It happened because I was a junior and I could. But remember, we've all been in those shoes. People make mistakes, and people might report things and not realize. Instead of yapping at them and saying, "You're doing it wrong," and you just close it immediately, have the empathy to put yourselves in their shoes, because software is hard. Documentation. Oh, documentation. I cannot stress this enough. Start as you mean to go on with documentation. I've talked about things like value objects and the way you code your library being self-documenting, but it will not document everything. And by documenting everything, if you want to do it all in the code, then you'll be using comments everywhere. Don't do that. It gets noisy really, really quickly. When you want to discuss your domain of how your code works or why something works the way it works, like you're getting around a limitation of the API that's underneath it, you can document it, but I'm saying document it as you go on. Don't be Freddie. Just not Freddie, Jason. I can't stand horror, which is ironic, really, considering the theme. Just documentation will get it will get developers on your side to actually use things the way they're meant to. And also, and this sounds stupid, it's fun, honestly. Here's some examples of ones that I've worked with in the past. Grav, which not a lot of people know about, and Statmatic. Grav itself is a flat file CMS, which is mostly coded in Symfony components in PHP. Statmatic is on top of Laravel and is a joy to work with. Docusaurus is, I think, Next.js. And these things are really fun to work with on top of coding your SDK. And it makes Yoda happy. Good tooling, I see. This one seems trivial, but it's not trivial. It's really important. And it's called labeling cadence, which sounds very, very fancy. But in your source control platform of choice, this one's a screenshot, for instance, from GitHub. People are able to open issues, and people are able to open pull requests. People will drop off and will not be interested in your SDK or your work if there is no communications which are set in thresholds. Set your own thresholds to yourself. Like, it's almost like a service level agreement to yourself. If someone creates an issue and no one looks at it and there's nothing on it for 3 years, it will just pile up and pile up and pile up, and people just will stop being interested in it. The labels in software, like in software platforms like this, give you the chance to give feedback without having to actually look and type, right? So, for instance, you could add a label like "it's a question," or "if this is released in a PR, it will actually be a release candidate for a solid thing, for a solid version." At the bottom is something, it's a custom one that I added to the Vonage one, which is, I am going to let you know that work has been scheduled in my Vonage workload, which is in Jira. So it tells the developer, your thing is being looked at, I promise. And that's really, really important to keep some cadence and to keep your project ticking over so people can see that it's active. If you don't do that, you end up with a problem of cadence in general, which is this. If someone wants to look at your work and they see 534 issues and 248 pull requests, it means that there is no management. It doesn't mean it's not active, because this is a very active project that I've taken this screenshot of. I'm not going to name it, but it means that there's now too much noise. When you get to 500 issues, who's going to tackle it? No one's going to tackle it. Really, I mean, I've mentioned quite a lot of you want developers to come into your project because you're coding for other developers to use things for you. You want them to be on your side. You want them to issue PRs. It's great because you get to collaborate with other developers. But they won't do it if you over-engineer your SDK. Over-engineering being an example picture that my team always laugh at me that I'm from Birmingham in the UK, and that is the world's first ever spaghetti junction. If you want to try and drive through it, it's an absolute nightmare. Over-engineering is a big problem. If people cannot understand your SDK or how it works, people are not going to do anything about it. They're not going to come and adopt it, because you might come in it with big brain and think, oh yeah, I'm going to use the decorator pattern for this. I'm going to use hexagonal architecture. I'm going to reverse engineer the core language by using Ruby's monkey patching. I'm going to reticulate all of the splines. If you do this, they're not going to do it. They'll just look at it and go, that's written by someone that is far too clever for me. I'm not interested in using this, right? And Steve knows this is a bugbear of mine, so it's going to be amusing to mention this. But cross compilers, good news. When Friday the 13th part 13 comes out, you'll be watching me, Jason, I keep on saying Freddy, compiling all of my other SDKs in Rust with a cross compiler. Cross compilers! No. Cross compilers make Jim sad. Here's an example of what happens if you don't consider the language you're coding in. This is real from PHP. Parse error, syntax error, unexpected. If you want to actually know what that is, that's an anglicized Latin version of the double colon in Hebrew. Why is that? I'll let you look that up yourself. What I am saying is that a cross compiler, this is cleverly written, that then goes and creates the SDK in TypeScript and Rust and creates it in Golang. It does not understand the intricacies of your language. Just pick your language and stick with it. That's my advice. Semantic versioning, or SEMVer. SEMVer is semantic versioning is awesome. So it looks like this. This is the way you version your SDK. You have 3 parts to it, 4 if you want epics, but ignore that. You have a patch, you have minor, and you have major. A patch says this will fix stuff. A minor says this is increased functionality. And major is this is a backwards compatible change. Backwards compatibility is super important. If you bust stuff, people who use things in production will start moaning at you and use something else, or your GitHub issues will become a trash fire. The major part of it when it comes to backwards compatibility changes are the things that are public in your API, not the things that are protected or closed off, and we'll get onto that in a minute. This means that you have to manage your deprecations. It's not all your code. Here's an example from the PHP library that I maintain. This method used to take a string, which was called URL, but now I want it to take a webhook object because we are moving to value objects. But it doesn't mean I can just change the signature until I get to a major version. So instead, I've done a shim where it says, if you pass a string URL because you've not given me a webhook, I'm telling you, you've got a warning, but after that, I will sort this out and create a webhook for you anyway. That says, for now, you're okay, but at some time in the future, this will go, and you can't complain about it because I've been telling you it will go. That's managing your deprecations. Similarly with communications, change logs. Change logs are really important because they tell you exactly where a bug has been introduced or something has been changed with the behavior. Keep a change log is a really good standard. There's a link to it. What you don't want to do is a change log where you just go change some things, whatever. Please don't do that. The build pipeline. This is important. Here is the path of the dark side. My Yoda impression is terrible. You need to introduce standards and quality within your SDK. So it says, for instance, in your build pipeline, you want to say you cannot merge if your formatting is whack. That's a linter. You cannot merge if your code is busted, which is static analysis, if you have a dynamic language that is interpreted. You cannot merge if you told me not to because my tests are broken because you wrote the tests. And also, you can't merge if you're going to introduce something that's going to be the next Heartbleed because I have something in security looking at that for you. The amount of tooling to do this for free is really, really good. There's an example of the test runner. That would be like PyTest, or it would be PHP spec, or not PHP spec, RSpec, or PHP unit, or PEST, or Jest, etc. Then you also have things like Sonar, which will take static analysis in any language. You have Sneak, which is open for open source projects at a free tier. And the same is true for code coverage, which tells you when you're introducing more code that is untested. All of that can be granted for free to you. I'd say it's kind of key to the quality of your software. Lastly, solid principles are how to maintain this in a way that's manageable. So if you've not heard of solid, you can look it up on Wikipedia. The important thing I want to focus on is the O, which stands for the open closed principle, which sounds very fancy, but it means this. There are two parts to it, the open part and the closed part. Open looks like this. I have a client in my SDK, and it looks something like a namespace that says my SDK client, and it has public functions on it. These are the things that you're open to, and you can extend off it if you want to. So Yoda says, midi-chlorians, as you know. Midi-chlorians, oh, thank God they went away. Oh, awful. That's open. You can extend off that. But you can't extend off everything because that makes no sense. So there is a closed part of it. The closed part of it looks like this. The things that the open things are looking at have services, or they have entities underneath the hood which are protected, which means you can extend off it, but you can't modify the encapsulated code within here. That is the domain of the SDK. Leave it alone or override it. You can override it, but you can't change what is supposed to be happening under the core. And what Yoda is trying to tell you there is, API sit stuff, me mindful one, Padawan. I'm not going to do Yoda for the last one, just to save my voice, I think. So that is protected. And then finally, this is really important. In Java, it was introduced, but we have it in PHP and we have it in Python. You have something called final. You actually saw Steve using some of it in his example in Laravel. This is slightly different. And final, being the closed part of it, is I think you must unlearn. I will not allow you to extend this any further because this is the final part of which this stops. You cannot modify this. An example, for instance, is, say, UUIDs, or a recent example I worked on was JWTs. A JWT exists and is created. You cannot modify that. I don't care if you want to do other things on top of it. I will not allow you to do it. When you create a UUID, there is an RFC on the internet that says it looks like this. So what are you doing if you're trying to override it? Don't do that. I'm not allowing you to. So that is, here is the parts that are open, and here are the parts that are closed. So it sounds very sort of daunting, but, you know, it's not. I want to encourage you to go and build stuff. But if you want inspiration, here are 3 classic kind of inspirations when it comes to SDKs that use APIs under the hood. You've got the two most popular in each one, so Node and PHP for Stripe. There are obviously Vonage ones. I maintain the PHP one, and Chuck Reeves maintains the Node one. And Sentry has got quite a good one when you want to do logging and things like that. Thank you very much. Like I said, I've been Jim Seconde. If you have questions about using the Vonage API to build cool stuff with communications next week, hit me up on one of these platforms or social media places. And we'll see how long Steve took to make a cup of tea or a coffee, because he might pop up or he might just leave me like hanging.
I don't know. How am I going to show? I've been watching. Your impressions are fantastic.
Terrible.
You've got to teach me how to do some of those. I've had my coffee. It's already gone. I That was awesome. So, has anyone watching got any questions? I've got one question.
I often tend to
Can
give
you do the
bamboozle people.
Groot? Can you do the Groot impression one more time?
Groot. Luckily, there's only one impression you can do of that because it's the only thing it says.
Yeah. You can't go too far away from it, I guess. So
that was right. Awesome. I've just bamboozled people then.
Yeah, just mind blown. Love it. You can tell you did theatre. You can tell you've done theatrical studies of some sort compared to monotonous Steve and his live coding. And then Jim.
Well, you did the actual building of stuff. What I will say is, I didn't put that in the bio. For anyone that doesn't know, I have a theatre background, and my dissertation is in stand-up comedy. I interviewed Dave Gorman and various other people, and Bill Bryson for how to actually do my dissertation. By the way, just so everyone knows, this is quite a dull talk of mine, where it's quite factual. If you want to see me really go bonkers, I'm on stage next week, and I really am on stage in Birmingham, and I'll be taking that for any conferences that accept it next year. And I really do actually run around the stage like a complete maniac. Steve is going to have the pleasure of actually watching that if he stays for the conference.
I will be staying for a lot of it, actually. I don't know how much. Well, I don't know when you're.
Well, mine's before the closing keynote, so.
Ooh, maybe.
Yeah, so that might be a bit late.
So we have one question from Chris. If you are faced with a deprecation because of a third party, how would you handle it? I.e., the API uses someone else who is depreciating a function. He wrote that wrong. Come on.
I know what you're saying, Chris. Instant major. Sorry, you don't want to do it, but you have to instant major, and you have to say this doesn't work. You have to tell your developers, because it's not your fault, is it? It's if it's upstream and someone has busted it or said we're just going to remove this, you're lying to your users if you let them continue to use it. If you use a deprecation warning and say, oh, by the way, it's deprecated using this, but if they've broken the underlying API, that's it. You have to throw an exception and then do a major release. But in theory, that should never happen. In theory. Have I worked with lots of APIs in the past that do that, including even big names like Shopify? Yeah. Yes, I have.
So you wouldn't wrap it for X amount of time, is what you're saying?
Not in that case, because in that case, if it's broken, what I didn't actually mention in the talk, and I think when I rehearsed it, I did, is you have to set for deprecations that will go into major versions. You do need to set a arbitrary amount of time. For instance, this is what I do with PHP versions. When PHP 8, all the security fixes and end of life goes on the 24th of January next year. I'm not going to deprecate using PHP 8 straight away, as much as I want to, because then it means language features means that I can use Rector PHP to then introduce lots of cool features, like when I get enums in there. But I can't do it because I have to think about my users. So I give it, I don't know, about 3 or 4 months of lead time before I start putting in the deprecations and start removing them. But if the functionality of the underlying API is broken, I don't have control over that. I have to major it. And then I will put in the change log, and I'll put a note out saying, I'm sorry, this is unexpected, but I've washed my hands of it. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. It's not my fault.
It wasn't me. Is there an easy way to create or generate a rough draft document as we build an SDK?
Yeah, I'd say that Scribe is probably quite good, but in the PHP world with Symfony and Laravel, you have a mountain of options to do things, and the same way that you do with TypeScript and with JavaScript. So have a look around at libraries. It's a very, very hot topic, but really what you're going to be looking at is annotating things properly so that an automatic parser can then pass it into a document. What I would say on that front is that will generate things automatically, but unless you put in the annotations, you expand out some domain logic and decisions you've taken, you might want to have a mixture of documentation using something that I like Docusaurus or Grav or Statmatic. But so you want a mixture of both. There's loads of tooling out there to do it. If it's API versioning, that's a bit. If it's APIs themselves, or you're building an API for your SDK as part of your SDK, that's a bit different because then you go into the tooling of Open API, and that's a bit different. But doc blocks are kind of a key here, I think. Also, really important to note, because this is something that exists within my world, which I wish it doesn't. If you're going to write it in a language you're not familiar with, do not take the methodology and way of working with that language to the next language. In the real world case, they have to work with an SDK where they took the way of writing automated documentation from Java and thought that they could just place it on PHP, and it does not work, which means I have to jump through mountains of hoops with code that doesn't look like PHP code in order to generate the docs. So use stuff built for the language or framework of choice that you're working with.
Could not agree more there. Final question that I can see popping up: any tools or services that check for known security issues in your freshly minted SDK?
Yeah, the two things. So that on that slide. Oh, hang on a minute, my thing's still up, isn't it? Come on, Bluetooth. Come on, Bluetooth. Right. There we go. Right. The two ones you want to look at there are Sonar and Sneak. They're pretty big names. So if you type in Sonar static analysis, the way Sonar is written, can first of all find security issues, and it can find bugs that are not even in your test runner. Sneak is the pure security part of it, where if you introduce a TypeScript bug where someone can hack it, Sneak on its free tier will pick it up for you. Those are the two things that you want. What you'll do is when you sign up to those accounts, you then put it into your build pipeline. So, for instance, I forget what the GitLab one is, but Bitbucket pipelines or GitHub workflows. So you'll find tutorials, and you'll find tutorials within the site, within those products as well, that tell you how to do it. But effectively, you open up a PR and say, I'm going to make a change to my SDK, and Sneak will scan it and say, no, don't do that. There's a TypeScript bug that's going to break everything if you do that.
Cool. I think the tooling around APIs and SDKs has definitely gotten a lot better over the last few years.
Yeah, when I started, the first person I saw talk about Open API was Billy Thompson, and that was mind-boggling now. That was in 2016, and I didn't know what it was, and it blew my mind that it existed as a thing. I mean, I know that we're not specifically talking about SDKs, but they're so sort of intertwined with APIs. And I just thought I've been at Vonage for just over 2 years now, and I do a lot of maintenance of Open API specs. When I joined and Open API and SDKs became my sort of speciality at work, I assumed everyone had adopted it and knew how to do it, and people just don't. And the amount of tooling on top of that, with things like read Dockley and Stoplight and things like that, it's just amazing now of what you can achieve. And people still have this sort of, I don't know, I like to call it an agency, a small-minded agency mindset, where it's just build it. Does it work? I think it does, and I will ship it. I would encourage you, please don't build your SDK like that.
Well, everyone's saying thank you, so I guess that's the end of their questions. The only bit of feedback you've been given is please add text below the icons for your next presentation. But
right, yeah. I was actually thinking I might. I'll see if when I give this talk in the future, I might put QR codes. There's going to be a lot of QR codes because there's a lot of information. So I think what I'm going to do for anyone watching is I might release this onto Speaker Deck at some point, but not quite yet, because the secret source must remain, because this is the first time I've given this talk.
Well,
so you got to see the debut,
and everyone loved it. from the feedback. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Steve.
As always, absolute pleasure to have you on. I will let you get back to your day being awesome at Vonage.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. And it is Vonage, by the way. People say it in French a lot.
Yeah. It's just confusing. You've got the Vonage and the Seconde. It's
oh, yeah, Vonage and Seconde. It used to be Seconde.
It's just confusing everyone with the name and where you work.
Just like to bamboozle people. I'm also James and Jim, just so you know.
James and just to make it even worse. Just to confuse you that little bit more. Well,
that's me in a nutshell. So yeah, thanks, and have a great hackathon next week.
Yes, we will. And thank you. Enjoy your day.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.